Okay, in this video tutorial we're going to look at what a virus is. So I think the commonly accepted plural of virus is viruses. We've got a lovely picture here. This is an electron micrograph, so taken with an electron microscope. So this is incredibly small, and this is actually a virus called a bacteriophage. Don't need to know that probably. But it's a virus that infects bacterial cells. So viruses are really interesting because they're not even technically considered to be alive. So most often they're not classified as living. And the reason for that is if you look at the Mrs. Gren criteria that a lot of textbooks and things use, so movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, it really doesn't meet any of those criteria except reproduction. So the only characteristic that viruses really have of a living thing is reproduction, and even then it's not. It's really just self-replication. They make copies of themselves. So basically, a virus is a small sequence of DNA, and I've put or similar. So sometimes it can be something called RNA, which is a very similar molecule. Basically, either way, it's a piece of genetic information surrounded by a collection of proteins, and that's it. So viruses hijack a cell's machinery in order to make more copies of themselves. So they're really just these little self-replicating protein bubbles with a bit of DNA or RNA inside them. So if you look here in terms of the size of viruses, they're really the smallest on our scale. Viruses are incredibly small. So if this were a white blood cell, a bacteria, many bacteria would be roughly this size, and viruses much smaller again. So zooming in here, you can see this is Staphylococcus aureus, a type of bacteria, and here we've got some. This is just a diagrammatic representation, but here's some electron micrographs of viruses showing the approximate difference in size. So here you can see much smaller than the bacteria. And this is actually already a fairly small bacterium. Some of them can be a little bit larger. So viruses are tiny. And if we look at the structure of a virus, viruses come in really different shapes and forms. So for instance, you can see these ones here that look sort of like a ball. I think this is called icosahedral, I might be wrong. But it's that sort of slightly ball-like structure where it's actually made up of a series of faces that are triangular kind of in shape. All the way to things like these look like sort of a moon lander. So it's the only difference here is basically these are just wrapped. You've got the DNA inside here wrapped in slightly different proteins, and they have different mechanisms for getting into the cell. They all involve these proteins. So in this case, at the base here, this kind of latches onto a cell and the DNA is kind of injected through there. Whereas these viruses here would maybe have a slightly different strategy or different proteins that enable them to get in. So if we look at the structure, though, there are always key elements, slightly different shape, but basically key components. We've got in the middle, so again, there are different names for this, but it's always the same thing. Nucleic acid is a fancy name for something that's either DNA or RNA. So RNA is similar to DNA, but it's single-stranded, few other chemical differences. But essentially, in the middle of the virus, we've got some genetic material, nucleic acids, DNA or RNA, all words that really are referring to the same thing. So genetic material, nucleic acids, or DNA or RNA. DNA, RNA, just slightly different versions of genetic material. And that's surrounded by what we call a capsid. And the capsid is just made up of proteins. Now that's all a virus really needs to have to be considered a virus. But some viruses have an envelope around the outside. Now the envelope is actually a piece of the membrane surrounding the cell from the cells that it infects. So the virus has taken a piece of the membrane from the cell that it infects, and it's added a few of its own proteins. We call these spikes, and these spikes help it to attach and enter its target cell. So key parts, all viruses have some sort of genetic material, some sort of nucleic acids, whether it's DNA or RNA, surrounded by proteins that form a capsid, and then some viruses have an envelope, which is actually a bit of membrane that it's stolen from the cells that it infects, and that will have in it some spikes that help it attach and gain entry into its target cell. And that's a really important note there, that viruses don't just enter any cell. They always have a specific target cell, and the reason for that are these spikes. These spikes will recognize certain proteins, certain things on the surface of their target cells. So our cells all look a bit different on their surface. They've got different things embedded into their surface. And so this virus will only recognize certain types of cells, whether those are liver cells or muscle cells, will depend on these spikes. And that's the reason why different viruses affect different parts of the body. So rhinoviruses, the ones that give you sort of cold and flu, infect the lining of your nose and mouth. Whereas other viruses will infect other parts of the body. So they're always very specific to a certain type of target cell or part of the body. So viral replication, basically it's a cycle that looks like this. The virus particle attaches to the cell and inserts its genome, another word basically for its genetic material. So we've got a few different terms we can use there. It's genome, it's genetic material, it's nucleic acids, it's DNA or it's RNA. Really depends on the virus or what textbook you're using, but all referring to this genetic material that gets inserted into its host cell. So once the genetic material is in there, basically it's copied. So it's copied, replicated, and transcribed. Now transcribed is a fancy way of saying expressed. So the DNA is used to make, and you can see that over here, more viral parts. So the DNA is essentially a recipe to make the parts of a virus. And those recipes, when we say that the DNA is transcribed or expressed, we're saying those recipes are being used. They're being used to make more of the viral parts, the viral proteins. So then what we get is we've got inside the cell lots of viral parts, viral proteins, and copies of their genomes, so either the RNA or DNA. Essentially, and those will self-assemble. So that's something that's fairly unique or pretty special about viruses. If you mix up in a jar the viral parts and their DNA or RNA, they will assemble all by themselves into a fully functioning virus. And it's just the chemical nature of these parts that they kind of stick or bond together. And essentially what happens in most cells is that so many viruses accumulate inside the cell that eventually it bursts, and when that cell bursts, the viruses come flying out, and they will attach then onto another cell, and the cycle goes on and on. In some cells they don't burst, instead the viruses bud out, so they leave, and a bit of the membrane, just grab a pen, so a bit of the membrane kind of will bud out like this. And it'll have the virus inside it in here. And eventually that will bud right out to form like a bubble which has the virus inside it. So it'll bud off like that. And this is essentially the envelope. That's what I was talking about just before when I said some viruses take a piece of the membrane with them. But either way, ultimately viruses always kill the cell that they infect. It can take some time, they can sit latent, they can hide or just stay in that DNA form for a while, but eventually, in order to replicate, they generally always kill the host cell. So, basically the parts of a virus: nucleic acid or genetic material, DNA, RNA, genome, different names for the same thing. Capsid is a protein coat that protects the virus's genetic material, and the envelope is membrane, a small layer of membrane that it's stolen from its the cells that it infects, that contains spikes that help it enter new cells. So reproduction, basically making more of itself, is pretty much all a virus actually does, and it's the only characteristic of life that they possess, and that's why they're often considered not living. A virus really only consists of two things: the proteins used for hijacking the cell, and the instructions or the recipes for making new viral parts, and that's its DNA or RNA, that genetic material. Different cells in our bodies have different functions, and because of that they have different proteins on their surfaces. They look slightly different. So viruses use those things on the surface of our cells, those proteins on the surface of our cells, to identify the cell type and to get into the cell. And that's why a certain virus is specific to a certain cell type. And that's why we've got different viruses or diseases that infect different parts of the body. Or even different species. Some viruses will only infect certain types of animals or certain species, rather than just infecting anything. So that's basically it for viruses. A little bit of an introduction to viruses there. I hope you found that helpful.